I can just check my list out the door. Thank you everybody so much for being here this evening. My name is Jeanette Bruce. I'm the Program and Communications Coordinator here at Whistler Public Library, and I'm the one who bothers you with emails, etc. So thank you for being here on time, the right night, the right place, all those important details. That means you read your email. So thank you. Before I go any further, I would like to express my gratitude that we are all able to gather this evening on the shared and unceded territories of the Squamish Nation and the Leewat Nation. And those words are always important, but it feels particularly important when we are speaking about the land. And I believe we're talking about Stadtland territory. Yeah. So, but nevertheless, still grateful to be on the territories we're on now. And hi, webinar people. I don't even know what territories you're on, but thank you for joining us. I have a little bit of in-person housekeeping and then a little bit of online housekeeping before I hand this over. So in-person people, hello, hi. Please make sure your phone is on a quiet setting. I'm checking too. Yes, wonderful. I actually haven't asked these guys, are we okay with pictures of the slides? Absolutely. I mean, it's being recorded, so absolutely. Presumably that would be fine. So you're welcome to have your phone out if you're taking notes or taking photos of the screen, but please make sure it's on a quiet setting. If you're not familiar with the library, the washroom is through the door at the back of the room. The library is now closed, so you won't be able to get into the sliding doors or out into the main space. So that is your only point of getting to the washroom. There's also a little kitchenette back there if you need to fill up a water bottle. And if you need to leave at any time, you are welcome to go this way. The doors are unlocked, I promise. Although you're going to want to stay. Online people, hello. Just a little bit of housekeeping for you, which is that you have almost no power on the webinar, but you can use the Q&A function. So we are going to ask you to use the Q&A function if you have questions for these wonderful speakers. And my colleague and co-host tonight, Sam, is sitting in the office and she is monitoring the Q&A on the webinar. So she will be going through your questions, getting rid of duplicates, that kind of thing. And so when we get to the Q&A period, in-person people, we are going to make sure that we get a mix, okay? So I'm going to stay in the room for the in-person questions, and then we're going to throw over to Sam for some virtual questions. Yes? Okay. And so it goes without saying, but I will say it. Please save your questions until the question period. All right? Okay, great. We have two very exciting speakers. I mean, the hottest ticket in town, honestly, because there are about 300 people on the webinar, or registered at least. We have Veronica Woodruff, a local face that you might recognize, and a non-local face. We have Glyn Williams-Jones from SFU. And so we're really delighted to have Veronica and Glyn here to talk to us about Mount Meager. What are we going to learn? I don't know. Let's get started. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Well, thank you. Yeah. How's that look at the backs? Looks good. Great. Well, thank you. So this evening, we're going to sort of take you through the story of Mount Meager, its discovery, its sort of geologic history, past events of the volcano, and the more modern events and the subsequent sort of impact of living next to very much an active volcanic system. So inevitably people go, Canada has volcanoes? Yes, absolutely. They're just up the road and they are active. You can see volcanic gases coming up through Joe Glacier right here. So Mount Meager, most people have heard of Mount St. Helens in Washington State, part of the part of the Cascade Volcanic Arc. And that arc of volcanoes, that line of volcanoes connected to the Pacific Ring of Fire, obviously doesn't stop at the border. It keeps carrying north, and once it gets into Canada, in fact, just before it gets into Canada, it changes its name. It's called the Garibaldi Volcanic Belt. And so a couple of years ago, through some good research by a number of Canadian scientists, we grabbed Mount Baker and Glacier Peak and took control of it, and it's now part of a Canadian belt rather than just the US Cascades. Inside hockey kind of stuff. But what we're going to be focusing on is Mount Meager, Charleston. And one of the key things about the Canadian volcanoes, why are they so different visually compared to those that we see in the US, in central Washington and Oregon? Well, we've got glaciers. The volcanoes here have undergone glaciation over many hundreds of thousands to millions of years, and they've just been eaten away. So very different style of morphology, of shape of volcano. So again, just to put this in context, it's just up the road, about 60 kilometers northwest of Pemberton and Mount Currie. So go up Pemberton Meadows, follow the Upper Lowell River, and you'll get to Mount Meager. So that's Mount Meager. Doesn't look like your nice pointy ice cream cone volcano at all, because it's a big complex of volcanoes that have evolved over millions of years. In fact, about 2 million years. So this is something that, again, most of us, most humans have, and I always am so challenged by this, starting to think of these kinds of timescales. We're in the millions of years to hundreds of thousands of years. And in fact, two of the eruptions that we'll talk about this evening are 24,000 years ago, and literally just yesterday, about 2,400 years ago. So geologically, extremely recent, yesterday. Again, on a bigger than human time scale. But that's what we're dealing with. So a lot of things can happen in this period. So we've got Mount Meager. It's well known for things like the hot springs. So that's evidence of hot systems there. This is not an extinct volcano at all. We can quibble about words, whether it's active or dormant. We'll say it's active, but it's not actively erupting. These are sort of the things that scientists get into nitpicking on terms, but it's important. And so it's a glacier-capped volcanic system, volcanic massif. You'll also sometimes see the term volcanic complex, because it's overlapping volcanoes that have built up over time. Okay, so there is the Upper Lillooet, Meager Creek, and one area that some of you may have visited. Just sort of keep an eye on this. This is Keyhole Falls. So there's a wonderful story, wonderful to me as a geologist, of the formation of Keyhole Falls. I'm going to take you through that very quickly this evening. So again, don't worry about the geology too much, but setting the scene. And part of it's also to show you the challenges we face trying to understand Canadian volcanoes. If we just sort of look at this area, you'll see this undivided volcanics. This whole area at the top of the volcano is very, very poorly mapped. We haven't been able to spend a lot of time trying to tease out the details because it's been covered by glaciers. We can't just drive up to the summit. You have to, at best, you can drive up to the Interjex facility, and then you have to helicopter up onto the volcano. So it's not easy to work on. We're slowly chiseling away at better understanding the geologic history, but it's a big volcano that is sitting up high on the basement. It's being pushed up over geologic time, being eroded over geologic time as well. And again, if you're into geology, some of the terms that you might see, there's compositions like basalts. Again, here in Whistler, if you drive along the highway, you see the basalt columns, same composition, but also rhyolite. The other end, think about the granite countertops. That's what rhyolite is, but it's a granite lava, if you will. But a key factor is it's this big mountain that's highly eroded because it's been evolving over about 2 million years. Lots of volcanic acid, gases, and fluids moving through the mountain. So about 2,400 years ago, the youngest explosive volcanic eruption in Canada that we know of, that we've been able to date, very, very young. So we had something similar to the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. So that's something that most of us can think about. We've seen it on television. The volumes are, again, beyond most human conception. We'll talk about 1 cubic kilometer. So instead of talking about how many Olympic-sized swimming pools those are, how that relates to Rhode Island, I decided, instead let's look at the pyramids of Cheops. So this is the Great Pyramid of Cheops. There's the Sphinx. 1 cubic kilometer, about 400 times the volume of that immense pyramid. So it's again another scale that most of us, me as well, really I find challenging. Put it into different scale. If you've all heard of the eruption of Yellowstone volcano, Yellowstone, when erupted, was 2,500 times that. So a lot of pyramids. Puts it in context. So we have this Mount St. Helens style eruption. We're sending up ash columns up into the air, up to about maybe 15 or 20 kilometers up. We don't have good handle on that quite yet. But it gets up and we find pumice, so that nice frothy white material that will float on water, deposited all around Mount Meager. And it starts to generate what are called pyroclastic density currents or pyroclastic flows. So think superheated clouds of gas and volcanic ash, hundreds of degrees Celsius, traveling at hundreds of kilometers per hour down the hill into the upper limit. So a big bang to start things off. And in fact, the bang was big enough. The ash ended up being sent all the way out to almost Calgary, about 2,400 years ago. So about 500-ish kilometers to the east. Here is this is work by a colleague of mine at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, actually an SFU alumni, Britta Jensen and her team, mapping out a whole range of different ash deposits. Now, one of the challenges, again, that we face in Canada is those darn glaciers. So the glaciers eat up, chew away those ash deposits that we're looking for to try to understand the volcano. Sometimes we can actually use this ash to understand the glaciers, if the time moves. So we send this fine-grained ash all the way out to Alberta. And again, these are fuzzy lines. We don't have very good control on. Still we need lots more young volcanologists to keep working on that. Over time, this volcano keeps doing lots of different things. We have this big explosion sending ash hundreds of kilometers away, but then it actually transitions and starts to squeeze out this incredibly sticky lava, viscous lava, called a rhyodacite. So it's almost the granite, the liquid granite, and it's trying to come out really like squeezing out toothpaste. Coming out on the flank, on the eastern side of Mount Meager, and it's trying to float, but it can't. It's too sticky. And it's cooler. Rather than a basalt at 1,200 degrees Celsius, this is cold. This is 800 degrees Celsius, what you're used to in terms of temperature. But starts to fail, and it's on this very steep slope, and it immediately breaks apart and transitions into this really unique kind of pyroclastic flow called a block and ash flow. So there's mega blocks the size of houses and cars intermixed with tiny fine ash, and it's got nowhere to go. It's flowing down into the upper Lillooet, and it basically can't spread out. So one of the key things, can't spread out, it stays hot. And in fact, it ends up melting itself back together again. It becomes what's called a welded deposit and forms a dam on the upper Lillooet that is 110 meters high and 3 kilometers wide. And then very, very soon afterwards, instantaneously, we've now we've dammed the upper Lillooet. And over the course of we believe about 2 to 3 months, a temporary lake of the upper Lillooet forms, about half a cubic kilometer of water. Now, this work is all done by a good friend of mine, Kelly Russell, who's now a professor emeritus at UBC, and his former students, slowly teasing together all of these different pieces of the puzzle. So we've now got this dam that is blocking the river. The river, the reservoir, is building up behind it, and eventually it's going to overtop this dam. and in doing so, it fails catastrophically. So this, if you've ever had the chance, is Keyhole faults. And so what we're seeing here is the remnants of this dam, of this fragmented rock that melted itself together again, started to build up this incredible reservoir behind it. The reservoir, all of the water was back here, basically filling in this loose material on top, and then failing catastrophically. Eventually just can't hold itself together anymore. And again, work by my friend Kelly's, one of his former research associates, Graham Andrews, they modeled this, and they think that 2.5 kilometers of that solid material unzipped in almost 8 hours. It's incredibly fast. Again, no one was there with stopwatch, so this is based on all sorts of modeling with a range of constraints, but absolutely incredible. And then this, that little slot canyon, that's what's formed in the last 2,400 years. This tiny little slot about 5 meters across. And then you can, if you stand up there, you just see the valley open up in front of you. Now, it's amazing. Some of that material, these mega blocks of this fragmented material, we found 35 kilometers downstream, and we know it was still hot when it failed, because those same kind of joints that we see on the basalts in here in Whistler, we see the same features, and those are related to cooling. So we know that those blocks were hot when they failed, that dam was there for a short, very, very short period of time, even human time scales. It's a really amazing story. Now, that amazing story was observed by the people living in the area at the time, and it's preserved in the oral traditions. And this is just one of many stories. Johnny Jones from Little Rock Nation, passed this on to some of my colleagues, and it touches on, a series of stories about, in this case, 2 brothers having a dream sequence, talking about the sequence of events of essentially canoeing down through the canyon, that slot canyon right there, all the way down to the ocean, and then bringing the salmon back. And so in those those amazing observations preserved in the oral traditions, the sequence of events fits perfectly with what we then modeled completely independently, and the stories are identical. And so this is an area of research that I'm particularly interested in, because I think there's so much information that we can bring to all sorts of past events where people were observing, and in fact, there's further stories going back much further in time, where potentially there were hunters on the top of Mount Meager seeing the ocean, which would suggest that sometime in the past, Mount Meager was 900 meters higher than it is now. Now, that sounds crazy, but Mount St. Helens took off 400 meters in one eruption. So it's not outside the realms of possibility, given how unstable the mountain is as well. So lots that I think can still be teased out if we can bring this different information together. So history has a tendency to repeat itself, and Veronica will talk more about the subsequent events. But in 2010, Mount Meager was the site of the largest recorded landslide in Canadian history. So a mere 53 million cubic meters, so only 20 times the volume of the pyramids of Cheops. Absolutely stunning. Bigger than the Hope slide, Frank slide by a long shot. And it failed down here. The volcano did not erupt. It was the volcano failing because of gravity, because of just unstable rock. And it failed down, high speeds, 200 plus kilometers an hour. Again, temporarily dammed the upper Lillooet, which then resulted in flooding in Pembroke Meadows and the temporary evacuation of at least 1,500 people, for certainly a few days. So really significant impact in now very modern times. And again, this is just some modeling done by one of our former PhD students, Giochino Roberti, trying to replicate the volume and the rock and the movement of that landslide and relate it to the evidence that we saw here in the river. So history repeats itself. It's something that we can use to better understand and maybe forecast future activity. So the elephant in the room with this large massif is it's an unstable massif. It's an unstable mountain that keeps falling down. And we've only just shown you one example here, but through geologic time, looking at the geologic record, we know that there are many, many very, very large landslides. And all of these red areas are slopes on the massif that are moving. We've been detecting this using satellite monitoring, and it's a specific technique called INSAR. It uses, in fact, the Canadian radar satellites to look for very subtle movement, but some of that movement is not so subtle, on the order of centimeters per month, which is a lot when you're thinking large amounts of rock. At least 20 slopes, 27 slopes, over 500,000 cubic meters. Again, a lot of rock, if it were to fail. And one that we're particularly concerned about, right up from where the volcanic fumaroles exist. This is what's called part Plinth Peak. If it was all to collapse at the same time, we might be looking at 300 to 500 million cubic meters, so 10 times the size of the 2010 event. A lot of ifs, a lot of things would have to line up, but this is something very much of concern. And so we actually are starting to monitor these slopes because it is something that is important. So, talking about another interesting story, this is the lovely aspect of science and serendipity, just good luck, good chance. There was a helicopter pilot by the name of Hannibal Preto who was flying over the area. He was working with biologists doing a mountain goat population survey. But Hannibal had done his undergrad at UVic in geology. He'd taken a volcanology course, recognized these ice caves and the gas coming out of them as being fumaroles, signs of volcanic degassing, whipped out the phone, took some photos, sent them to his supervisor, who sent them to my friend Kelly. Kelly sent them to me, and 2 weeks later we were in there with a helicopter taking a look and getting up close and personal to, as you'll see, we'll get even more close and personal in a moment. We did a bit of work with colleagues from Natural Resources Canada to look at earthquakes. Didn't really see anything, nothing clear, because our seismic network is not set up to monitor volcanoes. It's set up to monitor big earthquakes. So that's the challenge that we're facing right now in Canada. So some of the work that I do is to go out and sniff gases, various levels of toxic gases. So a little factoid, if we look at any volcano in the world except one, the number one gas that comes out is water vapor, steam. Second one is carbon dioxide. And then the third one is sulfur dioxide. What everyone recognizes is the rotten egg smell of the hydrogen sulfide. That's the nasty stuff, because that will kill you very, very, very quickly. And so, in fact, here I am with Giochino Roberti, that's Gio there, and we were about to go down, and I said, no, we're not going to go down into that crevasse, which is nice and open in the air, because one of the problems with hydrogen sulfide and carbon dioxide is they're invisible, and they're denser than air. And so it fills up cavities, any kind of depression, and in fact, we dropped one of these gas sensors into one of the crevasses just down, and it was reaching well over basically toxic, lethal levels. So not a good place to spend any amount of time. In fact, we found this unfortunate, there was 4 of these small juvenile finches that were right next to one of these caves. They'd obviously come in close because the gases were warm, but then they were overcome by these gases. So they are low temperature. They're about 90 degrees Celsius. That's low temperature. I get excited when it's 300-400 degrees C. That means we've got some shit at depth. But in fact, we want to go in and find those fumaroles. But I just said it's lethal. So here I am in the ice cave. I did have a gas mask. And we had a team who joined us from NASA. If any of you were around a few years ago, and they gave some talks at some of the schools, but they were with us testing part of a probe that they're hoping to send to Enceladus and Europa, so some of the moons of Saturn and Jupiter. And Meager was a test bed. So they're exploring for life, but working with them, we went down into some of these caves, and eventually 2 people who were actually expert cave search and rescue went down and they found the little crack, the fumaroles, where these volcanic gases are making it to the surface and then melting their way through the ice, and eventually we can observe them. So they're cool. They're about boiling temperature for that elevation. And I'll show you some video at the end, just to really some cool stuff. So the gases are something we want to look for with signs of change. We can keep looking. Do we see changes in the chemistry of those gases? It's going to tell us something about the volcano. Is it stable, or is there something that's changing over time? That's what we're always looking for. We're trying to forecast work. So the other thing we always want to do is be looking forward and try to. We haven't had a recent modern eruption, but we can do a what if. We can play with some scenarios and run all sorts of different computer models. This is the work of one of my former MSc students using some open source software to map areas. Well, what happens if we have more of those pyroclastic flows? Or maybe we have what are called the HARs, mud flows coming down into the Pemberton Meadows. We know, for example, that Pemberton is built on deposits from that volcano. So it's happened in the past. History has this tendency to repeat itself. So these are things that we're trying to model in advance so that people, decision makers, emergency managers can be planning what if we had a baby bear, mama bear, and papa bear eruption, what kind of impact could we have? These are the scenario approach that becomes useful. We can do all sorts of things. We know where volcanic ash went in the past. We had something in the future, looking at modern weather patterns. We could try to forecast. And actually, about 10% of the time, Rachel's work showed that if the winds were going in the wrong direction, there's a good chance ash would impact YBR. So, now we're looking at big economic impact. You do not want to fly planes through volcanic ash. The two do not mix. In fact, the ash melts into the turbine blades, eats the turbine blades, and your plane engines shut off. So you don't want to be in a 747 when that happens. You turn it into a large brick. We can bring all of this together, and we're doing similar work, working with Natural Resources Canada for Mount Cayley and Mount Garibaldi. With Mount Meager and Mount Garibaldi have been categorized as Canada's 2 very high threat volcanoes, in part because of the past activity and the limited knowledge that we have of these volcanoes, because they're hard to work on and there's not a lot of Canadian volcanologists. So we're chiseling away, but these are things that we can use to prepare, like anything. Some really, again, if you want to get into geochemistry, come and chat with me, but I just like this because it's really cool work that one of my recent PhD students just defended. She was looking at quartz crystals. And in fact, what she's looking at here is tiny little trapped bits of magma inside that quartz crystal. These are called melt inclusions. And some of them, they start off being circular if we cut them in half. They're spherical like a ball. But over time, they change and they take on the crystal shape of the quartz. So they turn into these beautiful little pyramids. They do that over time. So we now have a clock, a volcanic magmatic clock that we can use to time how long that magma was sitting there before it erupted. That was one of them. And again, this is perfect. This is on her thesis cover, this great little smiley face. So these are some of these melt inclusions, and these bands are changes in chemistry that she was able to map. And by taking these two different approaches, she got the same numbers. So two different clocks gave the same time. And so this magma was sitting there for maybe 100 years before it erupted. It sounds like a lot for us, but on the volcanic scale, 100 years is nothing. Especially, 2,400 years we had some. So we're starting to work and again get a better understanding slowly but surely of the past history of the Mount Meager massif in the volcanic area.
Got about 5 minutes.
5 minutes, perfect. So what again is really important, if we're going to be able to forecast these eruptions, we need to be looking at them. We need to be measuring, taking their temperature. Now, sending me into the ice caves full of lethal levels of volcanic gas is probably a one-shot deal. So we want to mitigate that. What we want to do is be bringing in more monitoring that we can have going in regular time. So it's challenging. Everything's helicopter access. So slowly, the moment we have a camera, well, two cameras, in fact, this was the image from yesterday, looking at those fumaroles, those volcanic ice caves. This one, a couple of years ago, caught a small landslide, about 200,000 cubic meters, again, over the same area. And if everything goes well, this coming spring, we will finally have a station permanently installed on the Upper Lillooet, in fact, at the junction of the Upper Lillooet and Meager Creek, where we're going to be listening to landslides and measuring the seismic, the earthquakes triggered by those landslides, but also listening to the pressure waves triggered by those landslides. So this has taken many, many years, and really it's always a team effort. It's really a public-private partnership between universities, local municipalities, private corporations, government agencies, everyone coming together, and it's challenging. But if we're going to be able to do anything, we've got to be looking. We aren't looking, we can't take the pulse. And we can't say, is the patient, awake or not? In this case, that's obviously an important question. So I'll show you two little bits of video shot by some colleagues. This was in 2019 when we first tried to go in there. And our two cave search and rescue, Christian and Kate, they tried to sort of Tarzan over, and their friends are hanging the rope here. This is 60 meters across. And so they tried to Tarzan over a mullion. It didn't work. They didn't have enough air. So that didn't last. So we came back 3 years later with the NASA team, and for 2 people to go into this cave system. Again, you can see all the crevasses on the glacier. Took a team of 10 people just doing the safety, the rigging, the safety. So it's an incredible exercise. And I'm standing there at the edge. So Katie is just amazing. She does, both Katie and Christian are search and rescue in Alberta. And so those are military grade gear that gets you 8 hours of breathing time. From their safety perspective, it's 3 hours, 2 to 3 hours under the ice. And here they are going down under the glacier. So their joke is they know how to time rocks. But as you're going down, this is the first ever measurement of subglacial volcanic gases in Canada. And not only we are now in lethal levels of gas, and you've also got rocks melting out of the ice. So there's about 40 meters of glacial ice over their head. And you can see all of the material that's just dropped down there. So incredibly skilled. This is not something we do routinely. This is a big, big effort. It was a whole lot of fun. Really working with all of these different experts to get to the same goal. And again, you can see where they were right down in that big hole. So with that, I will just pass on to Veronica now and say thank you.
Interrupt for 1 second. I just want to ask like a human comfort question. Are we too hot?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A bit warm.
Okay, let's stop. From the door.
Thanks, Lynn.
Yeah.
As you were.
So I recognize you've been drinking from a fire hose. I'm gonna continue that drinking from a fire hose. Pretty much all of this presentation of what Glenn's talked about and some of the things I'm gonna touch on is a presentation and stuff. We really should have done a series. But
Next time.
I'm gonna speak for about 20 minutes, just about what the implications are of some of the landslide debris and what we've been doing about it in Hamilton. I've been fortunate to spend a ton of time. I'm not a volcanologist or geologist. It's an environmental scientist that have been tromping around the woods around Mount Meager for about 20 years. And so this just sort of on the ground experience before the landslide and after the landslide was really valuable in understanding the dynamics around the fish, the wildlife, and the habitat implications. And I also work as an educator. So this is what I'm doing here. I'm really interested in sharing the story with you. So this is a picture of Mount Meager before the landslide in 2010. You can see where the Meager drainage is coming out here. There's a ton of deposition. This is already a mountain. This mountain's been described to me as a mountain made of ball bearings. So because of that volcanic activity and that melt and the glacier, so there has been a lot of landslides over time, and that's really evidenced when you look up at the drainage in Meager. And if you look at this red arrow at the bottom of this little drainage channel, and then you can see where the landslides come in. It's inundated this incredible deposition across the valley floor, about 2,400 acres. This was a huge event. It was the largest landslide in the world since 1947. And when I looked at that, I was like, holy cow, like it must have picked up all this material, but the reality is the majority of that deposition initiated from this secondary peak on Capricorn. And so that's the before and after picture. So that entire 53 million cubic meters came down all in one go at over 200 kilometers an hour. The mountain opens tomorrow. There's skiers and snowboarders here. I'm sure this is a big convex roll. And you know from avalanche safety that this is dangerous. There's water coming out from underneath it. This is just an unstable slope. And here's the after picture. And for scale, that's a helicopter. So you can see the scale of the size of what came down the mountain. And again, this came from Glen Bluff. Here's a model of what that looked like. It came down at 200 kilometers an hour, hit another mountain, did a big, huge sploosh, that's technical, and deposited upstream in Meager, and then, of course, the majority of the deposition. This dammed Meager Creek for 19 hours, and this is where all those evacuations came from, because the thinking was it was just going to potentially fold down, and this huge wave of water would come and inundate Pemberton. This is what it looks like today. You can see there's a ton of material sitting up there. It is highly mobile, and this is 2019, so this is almost a decade after. Actually, it still looks exactly like this, but you can see how mobile the material is and how it's easily moved by rivers. And rivers like to meander when they aren't constrained by things like roads and dikes and rail. They like to move side to side, and this play between deposition and scour, and you get these beautiful meanders. And the Lillooet River Valley looked like this up until the late 1940s. There was a huge flood in 1940, and the federal government said, hey, we're going to do a huge investment. We want Canada to do agriculture. So we are going to give a ton of money to communities across the country. So through the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Act, communities like Pemberton got a ton of infrastructure. So over almost 40 kilometers of diking. The rivers were straightened, 14 kilometers of meanders were cut off. The rivers were pushed up against the mountains on either side. And 473,000 cubic meters were removed from lower Lillooet Lake, lowering Lillooet Lake by 2.5 meters, which is a huge amount of volume. So I don't have pyramids, but I have these trucks. So that's like a big 32,000 of these guys just digging out the lower Lillooet Narrows, which had huge impacts on, it actually created, the Lillooet River was the largest growing delta in North America for quite some time. This is Pemberton. If you've ever been there, we have one stoplight. And you can see it was built on a side channel of the Lillooet River. This is a big back eddy that went into 1 mile. And so, yeah, that's thanks to the work that was done in the late 40s. this is what we've been able to build this community and have this really rich agricultural valley. So we've got the first flood, 1940, then we've done all the straightening, and then we go for a period over several decades where nothing really happens up until 1984, where there's this massive flood event. And this is when the dike infrastructure is really tested. It overtopped. There are, a lot of damage occurred, trains derailed, and the infrastructure gets upgraded again. So, and by the time the next big flood in 1991 comes along, Pemberton fares better. In 1991, this was a Labor Day weekend flood. The skiers bridge between Whistler and Blackcomb washed out. So next time you're walking between Whistler and Blackcomb, just have a look at how high Fitzsimmons have to get to blow up that bridge. And you can see those empty channels when you walk between the two villages. Those have been built since to take the flood flow, if we ever see a flow that size, which we did in 2003. This was the largest flood on record. And it was sadly tragic. People lost their lives commuting home from Whistler to Pemberton. And pretty much all dikes, most dikes overtopped, and there was serious damage. And then we have this landslide. So you can see the scale of events that we've had prior to the landslide. But since the 2016 flow and this 2021 flow, and we even had a flow in 2024 that's just above that 21 flow, all of those have resulted in evacuation orders and alerts because the slide debris is depositing through the river valley. And so it's reducing the capacity for flood flow, really increasing our flood risk. And so we had our floodplain modeling updated in 2018, and really good work done by NEC that has shown this 1 to 50 year flood period is about equivalent to the 2003 flow. So now what was considered a 1 in 200 year flow in 2003 is now more about a 1 in 50 year flow. And that's really just the likelihood of a flood occurring of any size. It is what that return period means. And most infrastructure that's funded and built in the province is usually built to the 1 in 200, which means all of our flood infrastructure now is under. So what we're doing about it, because all of this comes from that landslide. So the diking district, the Pemberton Valley Diking District, is in charge of flood mitigation throughout the valley. They're an improvement district and an autonomous agency, so not a government. And they dig out the sediment. The recommended amount of sediment to dig out is close to 200,000 cubic meters. It's quite a lot. They're digging out about 60,000 cubic meters from the most populated areas through town. And so they do this annually, but prior to the landslide, we still had a ton of sediment coming down. You saw what Meager looked like. We have other big rivers like South Creek that contributes a lot of sediment. So we had about 30 to 40,000 cubic meters annually prior to the landslide. Now our annual deposition is about 180 to 200,000 cubic meters per year. This is a lot of sediment to manage. And if we're going to dig out that much, you're going to make yourself your own mountain of vegetables. So that is quite a lot of material. So how can we use the principles of ecosystem restoration to support community resilience around this sediment deposition from this landslide? We have done landscape scale restoration projects. This is Miller Creek in Pemberton. This is a landslide that occurred on the edge of a logging road, and we use bioengineering. So using plant materials to build and engineering like fencing. It is essentially undetectable now, and there's conifers growing now. It was a really interesting project to work on and to see really function in terms of bioengineering. I have done this in the landslide debris. When the landslide came down, you can imagine if it's in August, it was from meltwater. And so the leading edge of that landslide was all the liquid and the pushed rivers and all of the trees that got mowed off of the slope. So the leading edge was really woody. And this is over top one of the most beautiful groundwater streams. So let's try to restore that. And so what we did, we pulled back the woody debris and we actually created a new channel through the landslide debris. We had so much wood, we were able to use them like pickup sticks over top. Because I always envision like, what does an old growth groundwater coho stream look like? It looks like this because the forest is there, it's been dropping branches. And if you don't have this, I've seen other channels built in Pemberton where the bears come in and they can easily just swap all the salmon out and they take one bite, they get so full and most of the salmon are left on the side of the river. This still allows bears to get salmon, but it still gives a salmon a chance. So this is like a really interesting way to use large debris, but not as part of the hydraulic process for fish habitat. This is about 5 years after the project. So that's Meager in the background. And now, again, these trees, you can hardly see the channel, but all the coho are there right now. It's actually a really great project to go see coho spawning. It's located right here at the leading edge of the landslide debris. So I've worked on different projects in some of the BC hydro systems like John Hart, or up at, if anyone's been up Gun Lake in the Bridge River Valley, you've seen they've been trying restoration trials. Because when you have a reservoir and then your operating levels, that sediment can be quite compact. So how are you going to get plants to grow when it's really highly compact? And some of the lessons I learned there, I thought, well, maybe we can apply it to here, not just to replant the whole landslide debris, but to create wildlife corridors, to start focusing on the higher value areas around riparian, that kind of thing. And I talked to my friend Troy Bikiti from Leland Nation, and he said, let's see what we can do. We got a grant from Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation to start to build this project out. And yeah, here's a couple of teenagers to scale for how big the landslide debris is when you're down there. You can see it's highly mineral. We had to be really strategic about where we were going to concentrate on planting. This is the heat dome. So also you can tell the highly distributed nature of the flow. If we had started planting trees willy-nilly, they could have easily been wiped out by a flood flow. So we built government partnerships, just like Glenn was saying. It's really important to build these government partnerships. We built academic and research partnerships. We've had a ton of work done by all kinds of different universities. And of course, industry partnerships, getting things like high definition LiDAR and digital elevation mapping, contributing to different components of our planting. Like, for example, if you're building a logging road and you're scraping away that beautiful top layer of soil with all the mycelium and all the great stuff, we can incorporate those things into our planting sites. And we have corporate sponsorship. So the Pacific Western Brewing, if you've ever bought caribou, it says right on the can, we contribute to planting. Well, they sure do. They've sponsored 3 years of planting, over $100,000 contributed to our planting of trees there. And so we started in 2023. We've planted about 250,000 trees now, and really focused on the areas that we could be guaranteed survival to start. It was all in partnership with Leewat Forestry Ventures. And the first place we started was where the lake was above the confluence where Capricorn came out. This is what it looks like today. It does look like it's vegetated, but this is mostly yellow mountain avens. It's like a really low growing shrub, like a ground cover. So we planted conifers. We also planted berry producing shrubs, which was a high priority for some of the wildlife work that some of the researchers had done, because the wildlife were shown to really concentrate to the edges. And again, this is just slide alder and that avens. And one of the things we did was partner plant with alder. So Cameron's hot. In the heat dome, 44.1 degrees. And every year since, except this summer, we've gotten over 40 degrees for at least one day. So planting trees that are sensitive is really important to give them the best chance possible. And so planting them with shade for the summer. And also alder has nitrogen fixing nodules to act as a little fertilizer blaster, and especially in this magical, it turns out, volcanic soil, because we have had excellent survival, despite what we considered with the foresters and I, what the conditions were going to be like. So this is what it looks like when you're wandering around the slide debris, and you can see all the little depositions and microsites, and we're really looking for that to create these, finding these little nooks where we can plant a tree so they can be a little bit shaded when they're out in the open. So just a couple more slides, but this is one with one of our government partnerships. We partnered with the village of Pemberton and the Pemberton Valley Diking District, and we got funding from the province. And we were able to hire Natural Systems Design. These are engineers from the US, from Washington. They have expertise in high sediment load rivers and creating fish and wildlife habitat from in places like downstream of Rainier, Mount St. Helens. And so they really understand managing sediment. And they came in and they did this plan for us, like what could be some of the options. Planting was one of them. But one of the other more important plans was millions of cubic meters have moved off the landslide debris and started to migrate into that channel. So this is a disturbed channel that is trying to do its thing as it recovers to some form of normal river function. What they recommended was engineered logjam. So building engineered logjams to be able to stabilize that movement of the lateral movement of the river. So building these side channels and also anchoring the sediment in place. You do this by pilings, you load up the front of it with the wood, and then as the river flows through, it starts to add more wood and it actually creates better function over time. So this can be used for both bank stability and then also for center channel stability. And as they also create these beautiful habitat units that are really important for fish, so big pools in front and this deposition in the back. And this is an older one. You can see how the woody debris starts to accumulate. And then you build these in units. So you're not building one or two, but you're building an enormous network of these engineered log jams that can lock the sediment into place. And this is what happens over time. The sediment accumulates behind over time, starts to get seed capture, and you start to grow trees behind it. This is important for all life stages of fish. We have coho, chinook, and sockeye in the upper Lillooet, and bull trout and cutthroat, really important for fish, all species and different life stages. So it creates habitat for both. And of course, humans, great pools. And here, this is my last slide. And I'm going to take 5 minutes or less to maybe rant. This is a network of 92 engineered log dams. Really interesting concept. One of the other ideas for managing sediment was to create a massive sediment basin that could be excavated every year. That is a really tricky feat of engineering. Where are you putting all the materials? Really costly. This is a way to manage about 400,000 cubic meters of sediment anchored in the center of the valley. It improves habitat for all of those things that I've talked about, both fish and wildlife. But here's the kicker. The last time, one of the last projects that Natural Systems Designs worked on was for the Army Corps of Engineers in the US, cost $200 million US. We don't fund restoration in Canada anywhere near that amount of money. So we have an expensive problem. The Deccan District currently is spending between $600,000 and $800,000 a year to excavate sediment out of the valley. But this concept reach costs $10 to $22 million. And this is a 2.4 kilometer reach. And there's really 35 kilometers that we could potentially treat in the valley. And again, there's no opportunity to fund at this scale. Restoration is done in small pockets and small projects that are short-term, no monitoring. And so it would be really interesting to see an investment. And I'm going to answer a question that might be in the 300 people online or in this room. You've just heard this whole presentation about landslides and volcanoes. Why would I invest $22 million if you're going to have an eruption or a landslide come down? And I think of that. There's this guy, Alex Steffen, and he has beautiful language around climate change. I really love his writing. And he talks about predatory delay. And we're in a shift now around predatory delay, because before it was like, hide the data, just deny, deny, deny. And now it's shifting to like, well, it's really hard. And what's the point anyway? Like, we can't really do anything about it. We're just going to have to adapt. So that narrative is shifting a little bit now. And I think about the adage is like, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. And we're geological timescales with Mount Meager, with landslides. So if we can get benefits in 150 years, as human beings, we've done incredible things in 150 years, like change the entire climate. We can get a short-term benefit into an investment like something like this to really show how green infrastructure works. That would be really exciting. This is one of 3 projects we have in Pemberton at this scale that we could transform ecosystems. So there's my pitch for restoration. This doesn't just transform ecosystems, but it actually transforms community because it's an economic investment. This isn't a single company that does this. People need to do this together in partnerships. You create a workforce, you create employment, there's economic benefits. So yeah, that's my rant for ecosystem restoration as an economic driver. And the Habitat Bank people who know how to build that, or who know the projects are out there, there's me in Whistler, and there's somebody in Squamish, and many in Vancouver, and this is all around the globe. Oops. Thanks. That's Glenn and I are going to take some questions, but those are our contacts if you have questions after, or if you would like to e-transfer $22 million. I think last week on site, Glenn and Kevin from the Deccan District were installing some seismic monitors. And so yeah, lots of work happening.
All right, folks, I'm just gonna do a quick reminder how Q&A is gonna happen. We will take questions in the room and on Zoom. We're kind of gonna try to go back and forth if we've got questions in both. And a reminder to these guys, if somebody asks a very quiet question in the room, we'll repeat it so it can be heard on the Zoom call. Okay, who wants to start us off? Bruce, go ahead.
So I'm just curious, so we have Mount Meager, but I'm wondering if you looked at the Joffrey slide and what the difference is between the two and the size and scope of them, having hiked up there after the slide. It's amazing.
So the Joffrey slide, obviously it's a different source material, so different type of geology. The scale is much smaller than certainly the 2010 event, but it goes to show that we live in a dynamic environment. One of my early geology teachers when I was an undergrad said, mountains spend most of their time falling down. And this is especially here in British Columbia, where we've got these geologically young mountains and the weather that we get in this winter. So in fact, Natural Resources Canada, one of our colleagues, he's actually an adjunct faculty at SFU, Jeff Crompton, is working on Joffrey, trying to better understand the risk and the trigger mechanisms. Some of the sort of academic aspects that we're interested in, but that really tie into changing climate, is the issue around permafrost melting. And so destabilization of the rock, changing the fluid, the way the water moves through these slopes is definitely a problem. And one of the bigger issues that we're facing too is you'll hear the terms now, cascading hazards. We're now all experts on atmospheric rivers because we keep getting clobbered by these massive humid air fronts, but those hit slopes that may have been affected by wildfires, that may be volcanic in origin and already unstable, and then we get these events. And if there's been problems around fires, deforesting a given area, it's going to be more problematic. So this is a challenge that we face throughout British Columbia, certainly on the West Coast here.
Let's see if Sam has a question. Sam, do you want to unmute and give us a question?
Yeah, I've got a couple here just asking about the current and ongoing monitoring, and specifically Saka asks, is there a continuous seismic monitoring of Mount Meager that could reveal movement of magma as a prelude to an eruption? For example, Iceland has an amazing monitoring with live publicly available seismic data everywhere, even on ice field covered volcanoes like Katla and Vatnajökull.
We'll repeat that.
Yeah. So for the room, basically, is there continuous seismic monitoring on Mount Meager? Iceland has an amazing network of seismometers around their volcanoes. The answer is no, unfortunately. So right now, I'm extremely I am Mr. Optimist, but I am very optimistic. Again, working with Kevin Clark here in the photo, what we're doing there is installing a baby seismometer. It's a citizen science seismometer called a Raspberry Shake. You can go and buy them. There's a whole really wonderful backstory to those seismometers, but we're starting that process. And so thanks to Kevin's work, we were able to get a large grant to get instrumentation and working closely with Intergex this coming spring. Once the access is there, we're going to be installing a permanent seismometer and sensors. They're called infrasound sensors, where we're going to be listening to any potential debris flows or landslides coming down Meager Creek and potentially the upper Lillooet. So it's a start. We're going to have a continuous GPS. We're going to start to build out, but that would be the first continuous monitoring of any volcano in Canada. We are set up to monitor the big earthquakes, but those networks, those sensors are too dispersed for the volcano. So I see this as a start. And ideally, if you're going to be able to track the movement of magma, we need at least 6 seismometers on top of the volcano and another, 3 or 4 away from the volcano. So we will have 1. And we'll hopefully build out 2 to 3 more in the next year or 2 if all goes well. So this is a start, like anything, but again, it's going to happen finally.
It's been categorized as like the most active volcano in the world with the least amount of monitoring.
Yeah.
So like it's not the most active, but it's the one with
The least amount of monitoring given what we've got. Yeah.
Let's go to John.
This Intergex is a geothermal project.
No, hydropower. Intergex is hydro, and Meager Creek Development Corp is the geothermal.
It's the development of, well, both of those, I guess, he would have a shared interest in this monitoring. Would that give the opportunity to share the expense?
Absolutely.
Of all that as well.
Yep.
Develop a non-fossil energy source.
Yeah, and they've been fundamental partners right from the get-go. So those cameras, Intergex paid for the helicopter to sling in 2 telephone poles and the crews to install that. The cameras were donated by another company, a local Squamish company, New Point Systems. And so the corporate partners have been critical to making this happen. Canada, British Columbia, we have a lot of different natural hazards. Some of them are more intense and more frequent, like the wildfires. And so how do we get the volcano monitoring, the landslide monitoring higher up the sort of priority when we've got these incredibly intense weather events? So it's always a challenge, and there's never enough money to go around. So this is where I think having partners from across public, private, academic is how to do it.
And a lot of clear-cut logging been done along that hillside as well. Has that been a complicating factor?
It has a little bit. We on Mount Meager, there's another presentation on the Pemberton Library. We had one of the largest forest fires in 2015 in the Coast Mountains. So between the Keyhole and the Upper Lillooet fire. So between those 2, it was only about 35,000 hectares, which sounds tiny now that we're going through these 1 million+ hectare seasons now in the interior. So, but yeah, it was logging, then this extremely rapidly moving forest fire. And this is another one of the motivators for the planting project, is because the seed bank isn't there for in the surrounding forest, because the forests are burnt in the valleys.
Sam, do you have another question for us?
Yeah, a couple of people have asked along these lines, but Nicola's son wants to know what it would be like in Pemberton if Mount Meager erupted. Would we get warning? What would we see? And what would it be like?
So the question is, if Meager were to erupt, living in Pemberton, what would we see? What would it be like? The question is, Well, it depends. So, yeah, and so if it's a small eruption, if it's a baby eruption, then you might just see, in fact, some small steam bursts from the mountain. It could be, if it was bigger, yes, you could start to see ash going up into the air. The good thing is that Meager is still quite distal. It's 60 kilometers northwest of Pemberton, Mount Currie. So the risk to people, if it's a localized kind of eruption, if it was just lava flows, you might see some glow on the horizon, but it wouldn't be dangerous. There could be some problems around blocking of the river and flooding, depending on where the lava flows went. If we started to get something like the last eruption 2,400 years ago, it would be much more impressive. We're looking at now columns of ash going up, many tens of kilometers. So very similar to the events that we saw in 1980 on May 18th at Mount St. Helens. And so ash would be a problem for people living in Pemberton. That volcanic ash is volcanic glass. It's not like carbonized or fire ash at all. And so that's bad for your lungs. It's bad for any kind of electric engines, motors, because it's very abrasive. So that would be a problem. Certainly there would be issues potentially on farming, impacting the agriculture, any livestock. This could be a problem. The key thing is, would we get any warning? Right now, no, because we don't have any monitoring yet. That is the big challenge. We have satellite monitoring, but that satellite monitoring is not fast enough. It's good, it's better than absolutely nothing, but we need much more denser networks of sensors to actually have the warning, to know what is normal, what's baseline, what's background, and be able to look for that change.
I saw a hand over there. Go
Yep.
ahead.
So how do the glacier gases or the volcanic gases are coming from the base of the mountain, like in the glacier, rather than from one of the peaks?
It's actually on the gases that we see at the moment, and again, largely because the glacier has been melting so quickly that we've now got these gases melting their way through. But they are in this sort of, I guess, a cirque dome-shaped crater-esque area called Job. So it's on the flank. It's still up very much high on the edifice, on the massif. And so those gases are coming through a crack in the ground.
A glacier cirque, or is that more like a volcanic caldera?
We believe that is a glacier cirque / landslide scalloped feature. A caldera would be a much larger structure, something like Yellowstone, for example. We don't have very good understandings of the volcanic crater structures because the glaciers have just been eroding them. So we don't see any evidence. And certainly where the last eruption occurred was very much on the side of the volcano, and there's no evidence of a crater now because of the glaciation and sort of ongoing erosion. But that's always a challenge that we're always trying to investigate. But it's hard, definitely. Yeah.
Sam, do you have another question for us?
Oh, plenty. With the video at the beginning, it showed the gases coming out. This person was wondering if that's a 24/7, like constant, and another person was just wondering how hot does that gas get, and if it gets up to the 300s that you were talking about, or does it get hot enough that those cavers that were going in, are they likely to burn themselves walking in amongst that?
So the question is, those gases that we saw in the video, how hot are they? Have they really been kind of responsible in part for melting the system? At the moment, the gas temperatures, when you're standing on the edge of the crater in the air, it's about 25 degrees Celsius. So the gases have mixed with the atmosphere that's entered underneath the ice. at where that little crack was, what we call the fumarole, where you could see some of that yellow sulfur forming underneath the ice. The highest temperature the two experts, Kathy and Christian, measured was about 90 degrees Celsius. So that's quite low temperature. It wouldn't be enough to burn them. It's essentially boiling temperature for that elevation. I have been in environments where my boots were melting because the ground was 250 degrees Celsius, and I was surrounded by gases that were about 200, 300 degrees Celsius. So that is hot. I've sampled some fumaroles that were reaching 700 degrees Celsius. So if you ever look at the videos of the volcanologist in the silver suits, they don't have silver on their boots because you want to know if your boots are melting. If they're insulated, then you're going to fall through. So you try to avoid that kind of thing. But in that situation right now, the temperature is low. So it's the kind of thing that we would want to be able to monitor if we could find a way to do it continuously. And so when the NASA team were here, they had all sorts of amazing ideas about ways to get sensors in there that could survive under the glacier and send the signals back. If only we had their budget. So that robot head that they were testing, it was called EELS, was for something that would be launched in 30 years' time. So that's the kind of steady funding that they deal with, even when there's cutbacks. So if we had a tiny fraction of that, then we'd maybe have a better chance at monitoring these.
All right, go ahead.
So I've had the privilege of going to Iceland a couple of times, and I've never associated Iceland with ice. I associate it with heat. It's you can feel the heat there, thanks to the geothermal energy it's have everywhere. And I know there's been talk about that. Is there any timeline that you can suggest that one day we turn on our faucets or we go to Meadow Park pool swimming in that gorgeous warm water?
I think so. The question online too is there the geothermal energy here in Canada and certainly in British Columbia? It is there. The volcanic belts sit on top of hot rock. And that is clear. So about now, almost 4 years ago, there was a large project funded by Natural Resources Canada to look at doing big scale geology and geophysics to try to understand the geothermal potential underneath basically the sea to sky corridor. And it's there. We see this immediate expression at Meager. In the past, some of the geothermal drilling they hit temperatures of 240 degrees Celsius. So that could easily be used to just that, that value is sufficient to flash it to steam and turn a turbine. The challenge at Meager has been, funding. It's also the fact that the mountain is challenging. It's that long history of slope instability makes it a challenging feature. But there's amazing work that's being done, in fact, in new technologies. A lot of it sort of developed in Alberta for the petroleum sector, what's called horizontal drilling, where you can drill down and then go horizontal for many, many, many kilometers. So that opens up the potential to maybe access geothermal heat away from where it's dangerous for a facility. And in fact, in Iceland, one of my colleagues, he's a prof at University of Munich and a Canadian, and they are working on it's called the Krapla drilling project. And their goal is to drill into magma in Iceland. So at 1,000 degrees Celsius, and put a heat exchanger in the magma and take energy, not even just geothermal energy, but magmatic heat. And the technology is there to handle it. So, it's an exciting time on that engineering side. And I think there's ways to, certainly in Canada, the geothermal energy is zero carbon, it's base load, but it's extremely expensive to install. The exploration for geothermal energy is costly compared to other systems. So there's always that trade-off. But any energy system, we need a distributed, diverse, sort of sources of energy. And geothermal is a good one. And we've got the hot rock here. They've done it in Mexico, in Chile, and Iceland is a perfect example. It's a bit easier in Iceland. The access is easier. It's right there. But it's absolutely, the technology is well established now. So it's a matter of timing.
Sam, you have another question for us?
Yeah. I'm going to try and combine a few here. So why do we have funding to plant trees but not for seismometers? Is it to do with government funding? And we are not NASA, so what is a realistic budget to provide a realistic alert system to all residents of the valley and downstream?
Okay.
Yeah, well, I can speak to the
Yeah.
funding for trees because,
Sorry, can you?
sorry, the question was, how do we have funding to plant trees but not for monitoring? And I think the scale is just different. And also how funding works is there's different pots that align with different priorities of whatever agency is offering the funding. So the funding came from the province and the federal government under the 2 billion tree project funding initially. So that is where that funding came from. So you can't fund seismic monitoring out of 2 billion trees. And 2 billion tree or seismic monitoring, from what I understand, very expensive.
It's very expensive. And so that is a challenge. The seismic monitoring, in part, yes, it gets down to funding. I spent much of my career working in Central America, in countries that were much less wealthy than we are here. And yet, they have instrumentation. Money can go in to do monitoring if the political will is there. But cutting through that, getting to the decision makers to say this is important, is really challenging. And so we're incredibly fortunate to find out just a few weeks ago that we got this amazingly big grant of just shy of $1.9 million for 4 years between SFU and UBC. And it was a UBC-led team project. Veronica was involved with it. And but $2 million doesn't go very far when that is to pay for people's salaries, graduate students, never mind long-term monitoring. Part of it is to do long-term monitoring. And there's some really cool things that are now available. In fact, using internet, like fiber optic cables, to use them like seismometers. People have been doing this in Iceland, and we, in fact, tested it on Meager about 4 or 5 years ago, and they ran fiber optic cable and showed that it could work on the glacier. So there's some things like that where if the infrastructure is already in place, can we get the instrument to effectively turn that internet feed into a 10,000 seismometer equivalent? So there's ways around the limited funding, but it's always a chase. And as an academic, I spend more of my time writing grant proposals, and Veronica in the same boat, trying to find little pots of money here and there. And so, that photo right there, it's this raspberry shaped boom, is a little citizen science seismometer, cost about $1,000. It's not the $50,000 gold standard seismometer that we will be getting in there in the spring, but it's a low cost one that we can actually deploy, and people can go and buy them and put them in their homes. So there's ways around that. And let me know if you're interested, because NRCan have started a project called schoolshake.ca, and they're trying to connect schools to these little seismometers and put all the data together into that system. So bringing schools and science together. But we're using these low-cost sensors in the meantime, because it's better than nothing, and they actually do a pretty decent job. And if they get crushed by a small landslide, well, it's not a $50,000 unit, it's a $1,000 unit. So.
And Glyn touched on this. The reality is, from an emergency management perspective, a high consequence but low probability risk is not gonna be top of the chart
Yep.
for funding. It's those high consequences, high probability. So the fires and floods start, that's where the funding is. And even the funding for those things are hard to
Yeah.
get.
Yeah, so we're always fighting over these things. How do you find that balance?
One more question for him. Dawn, go ahead.
From what I've heard, it's in rural territory. And I've heard about John Creek being fairly unstable. What effect would that have on the Willamette River?
You can,
So, basically that there's other areas on the mountain like Job Creek where there's unstable slopes. And what are the potential impacts on the Lillooet, on the upper Lillooet especially? It depends. It's going to depend on how big that slide is. So we, in fact, on Mosaic Ridge, there was some fairly big movement detected by satellites, by that INSAR system run by Natural Resources Canada. And we could see movement, but it didn't collapse. It didn't fail. And so that was a big question, is how big, what is moving, and the mountain is so diverse geologically. So one area is going to have a different style of movement. So it really does get down to, it depends on what moves and how big. But certainly if it gets into the drainage network and flows down into the upper Lillooet, that's now more sediment into the system. So it's not going to help. But it's going to very much depend how big an event. So that photo that I showed of the debris coming across the glacier in 2023, about 200,000 cubic meters from Job Peak, that didn't act, it wasn't big enough to make it all the way to the upper Lillooet. So yes, some of that material will probably slowly work its way in, but it was too small to have any significant impact, probably. Again, we haven't measured that. We just don't have the wherewithal to do that. So, the long story short is it depends, but what we have to do is we have to keep looking. We've got to be monitoring so that we can understand what the impacts are and measuring it in the river system, in the hydraulic system, so that we can actually be in a position to better manage that. You're not going to stop these events. It's a natural system. Can we mitigate the impact?
We are going to take one more question from online. Please keep in mind, folks, email addresses are up there, so one has to assume that they want us to use those.
Absolutely. Drop us a line.
Send an email. Sam, do you have a good one to finish us off?
Oh, just a brief one. Let me just scroll back up. Sorry. In a previous seminar you've held, it was mentioned that the mountain grew over a few months in the summer. Is it still growing? If so, is it similar or less or greater?
So the mountain did not grow. The mountain grow over a few months. So that certainly isn't the case. The mountain has been moving. Those different slopes are moving at different rates. What we did notice definitely during the heat dome, the glacier, Job Glacier, where those fumarole caves are formed, that disappeared is almost the case. During the heat dome, about 5 meters of ice disappeared from that glacier. It's just horrific. But certainly the mountain is not growing by any means. It's much more falling down. One of the kinds of signals that we would look for if there was increased volcanic activity is, in fact, any kind of evidence of the mountain being pushed upwards. So deformation, basically suggesting that there's magma coming in at depth, pushing up and basically displacing parts of the mountain. The challenge is, how do we separate out that signal of it being pushed up from also the movement of it falling down? So this is the kind of sort of scientific investigation that many of my colleagues and some of my students are trying to tackle. But so the mountain is not growing at the moment, as far as we know, given the monitoring that we have, which is limited at best.
Be on Zoom, thank you for being here. I'm really glad that we were able to include so many more people by offering the webinar. We will say good night to you. Don't forget to email Glenn and Veronica if you have any more questions. So good night, Zoom. In person people, you do have a few minutes to come up and say hi to these folks. Thank you so much for being here. We hope we'll see you again at the library for another program.
Okay.